Some years back, a candidate was running for president and was campaigning in West Virginia. Some of the local coal miners were not real happy about it when the candidate asked for their vote. Vote for you? One of them jeered, "Why, I'd sooner vote for the devil." "Well, fair enough," said the candidate, "but in the event that your friend doesn't run, may I have your support?" Well, that is one candidate who was not put off by a little opposition. And that's good. That's good. The mark of a successful person is that he or she does not give up just because things are not going his or her way. Jesus evidently appreciated people who refused to quit. He once told a parable, as Lori read for us beautifully earlier, a story about a widow who had a fierce determination for justice. Her determination was so great that she pestered a certain judge until he granted her request. And this was no ordinary judge. Hope you all caught this. We do get some background here. It's important. Jesus described the judge as one who neither feared God nor cared at all what people thought. So, in the Old West, let's say, in the Old West, he might have been described as a hanging judge. A hanging judge. Strong men dreaded appearing in his court. Lawyers tread softly as they approached his bench. But this stern judge was no match for this persistent widow. She was not a person of influence. She's not a person of power. She's certainly not a person of wealth, but she had a characteristic. She's got a characteristic that would stand her in good stead. And that was that she would never give up. She'd never give up. She simply wore him down, the text tells us. She wore him down. Just like dripping water will eventually wear down the strongest marble, her persisting prevailed. Now, even though he initially refused to hear her case at all, he finally ruled in her favor, saying to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice." That's the judge speaking to himself. It's a fascinating story. It really is. It's fascinating. But here is what's really interesting. Jesus is using he's using this story as an illustration of why we should never give up on prayer. If your prayer is seemingly not answered at first, don't give up, says Jesus. Keep asking. Keep asking. There's a story about a little boy who was praying, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." Then there's this long pause. Long pause. He couldn't remember what came next. His mother prompted him from his bedroom doorway. If, she said quietly. The little boy prayed, if, then he brightened up and said triumphantly, "If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." Persistent prayer. Persistent prayer does not mean empty phrases that have no deep meaning at all for us. It also doesn't mean that our prayers have to be long and eloquent. I am convinced this is one reason of several. People just refuse to pray in public. just refuse to do it. The truth is they don't have to be long and eloquent. I'd suggest they shouldn't be. I try to avoid what I call preacherage. Preacherage. I won't get into all the word preach that preachers love to use, that you never talk that way in everyday life. Never. If they go before God with this, and I don't think God's fooled by that. Martin Luther once put it succinctly, the great reformer. Martin Luther said, quote unquote, the fewer words, the better the prayer. Let me repeat it again. The fewer the words, the better the prayer. No meaningless platitudes, no high-sounding phrases, no lengthy dissertations, but keep praying. Talk. Keep praying. He already knows what's on your heart. You're never going to catch God by surprise. It's ridiculous. If there's a need that you have or someone close to you has, keep praying. Don't worry about eloquent words. He's not looking for that. Keep praying. Keep praying. Even if the heavens are silent, the world is literally crumbling around you, or so it seems, and there seems to be no discernible answer, keep praying. That costs you nothing. Keep praying. Even if your spouse says you're a fool, even if they say you're foolish, your friends doubt your sanity, okay, your own faith grows thin, you're having trouble finding any faith at all, keep praying. Prayer makes a difference. It makes a difference, friend. Prayer changes events. It changes people. It's so sad. So sad that many of us are neglecting this tremendous resource. I'll give you something in the way of an illustration, as Jesus would often do. There's a rural area of Texas that if you had visited this particular part of Texas about a half century ago, you would have discovered grinding poverty. Just grinding poverty. And today, you'll find lush, green, irrigated crops, well-furnished homes, new automobiles, newly paved roads, well-dressed people. And if you ask them what happened, you'd be told that oil and gas had been discovered under the once barren soil. During all those earlier years, you see, in poverty, the farmers had been living over untold riches. Millions upon millions of dollars in natural resources hidden right underneath their feet. They simply hadn't discovered it. They didn't know, but they're walking right over the top of it. He finally unlocked them and used them to change the quality of their lives. Many of us live spiritually barren lives. And the sad thing is that within our very reach, are untold spiritual riches. In the words of a popular song, help is only a prayer away. I'll tell you another quick story. It's true. It said that when Lawrence of Arabia came to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, he brought with him a pack of Arab chieftains who had never, ever seen running water. They'd never seen running water. They came from a land where water was scarce, greatly, greatly valued, but right there in their hotel room was a seemingly endless supply of this precious commodity available at the mere turning of a tap. And when these chieftains were preparing to leave Paris, Lawrence found them literally trying to detach the faucet. Detach the faucet in their hotel bathroom so that out in the dry, barren desert, they would always have water. And Lawrence tried to explain to them that the water was not in the faucet, but in huge reservoirs many miles away. See, these chieftains were convinced, however, that there was something magical about the faucets themselves. And so it is with many of us who get dressed every Sunday, drive to church, sing hymns, do all the good things religious people do, but meanwhile we've cut ourselves off from a reservoir a reservoir of spiritual renewal by allowing our personal prayer life to become, well, almost non-existent. Study the New Testament. I beseech you, study the New Testament. See how important prayer. See for yourself how important prayer was in the life of Jesus. See how much he talked about prayer with his disciples. See the effect of prayer on the early church. To dismiss prayer as a last resort, you've heard this before or you've thought it, well, I've tried everything else. I guess now I'm going to have to pray, right? The last resort approach, when you're really, really desperate, is to miss the meaning of the gospel. All prayer is talking to God on a daily basis. That's all it is. The very power and presence of God is available to the believer. The Word that became incarnate in Jesus Christ is still at work in the lives of persons today who are open to his leading. Prayer is the means by which we connect ourselves to the one who is the creator and sustainer of all life. But I think there's something more about prayer that we need to see, and it's this. God does not work according to our time schedule or even according to our methods in meeting our needs. He just doesn't. Why should this poor widow have to plead and pester and cajole this judge to grant her wishes? I mean, isn't this an acknowledgement that sometimes heaven is silent? Listen to Jesus' words in verse 7. He said, "Will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night?" Now, have you ever been in a situation where you've cried out day and night? Having affirmed that prayer does work, we must now add that prayer is not Aladdin's lamp. There's no genie who suddenly appears to satisfy your every single request. Every saint has known through the ages what it is to go through the dark night of the soul. I know, and I'm sure you do too. Why it won't be known until God takes away the veil and we see him face to face. Perhaps the only acceptable answer is that we're creatures and he's the creator. We're children, he's the Father. We're finite, he's infinite. It's a humbling thought. It's very humbling. We are so sure that we know best. It is infuriating to us to think that God may be saying to us, even as we say to our children, not now, not today. That's not in your best interest. That's not in my plan. If your trust is not found in God's absolute love for you, you will never have a satisfying prayer life. There are just some things about God's work in this world that we'll never, ever understand. For example, we don't believe that God deliberately afflicts his children. And yet it's impossible to ignore the fact that some of the world's greatest treasures were forged in fire of adversity. In the latter years of his life, the imaginative writer John Milton lost his sight. His body was tortured with illness. Many of his friends forsook him. There were many, many nights and days when he cried aloud to God for mercy. However, it was during this exact time that he produced his immortal classic, Paradise Lost, which was must reading. think it still is. Must reading for students of the English language for over 300 years. The equally influential writer John Bunyan would have prayed for deliverance from prison, but it was during that confinement, when he's in prison, that he produced Pilgrim's Progress, work that inspired millions. Again, we would caution that it's not God's intention that any of his people suffer. Still, the purpose of this world is to create souls who can glorify God and enjoy him forever. And sometimes adversity enhances this process. It just does. Alfred Russel Wallace, a prominent scientist, once observed a monarch butterfly trying to get out of its cocoon and wrote this about it. He wrote, quote, "It struggled, it pushed for a long time until finally its body emerged fully. The butterfly rested momentarily, fluttered its wings, and then flew away." And Wallace then wondered what would happen if he decided to intervene and help the process. So rather than waiting for another butterfly to struggle and emerge from its cocoon, he cut open the cocoon. He cut it open himself and waited for the butterfly to fly away. Well, instead of flying triumphantly away, however, this butterfly, it crept moodily about, drooped its wings, and died. You see, the struggle to get out of the cocoon, Wallace discovered, was nature's way of helping the butterfly develop. It's a must. You have to have adversity. Adversity is part of God's plan for producing beautiful butterflies as well as producing beautiful souls. Lately, I've been researching Jim Morrison. How many people we got love the Doors, the musical band? I love them. Love the Doors. It's not for everybody. I get that. It's fine. What band is? What singer is? Fascinating person. You probably heard a lot about Jim. It was interesting. They had on TV that out of all the American icons, I forget what the numbers were, but Jim Morrison beat Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo as an American icon. Doesn't get much better than that. Ranked higher than Scooby-Doo. I don't know how much you know about Jim Morrison. I certainly don't agree with everything he said. Again, he's a singer for the Doors, great group. We're talking the 60s. Keep that in mind. This is the 60s. The 60s. I love what Robin Williams said. He said, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there, okay? That's just the fact of the matter. You weren't there. Jim Morrison, for all the things that he was, yes, he was personally tortured. He had tortures of the soul. Of course, who doesn't? What great artist didn't? We need to talk about Michelangelo or Van Gogh or Picasso. I mean, name somebody. Of course he did. Imagine all that being thrust upon you in your 20s. Unfortunately, he's a member of what we call the 27 Club, the unfortunate 27 Club. A lot of people don't know this. He died when he was 27 years old. 27. Jimi Hendrix died at 27. Janis Joplin died at 27. Amy Winehouse died at 27. You want to be 27 in the music business, particularly at that time. But Jim Morrison had a staggering IQ. Staggering IQ. And the reason I bring him up, graduate of UCLA Film School. That's where he met the band members. The last thing he's looking for is to sing in a band. It's the last thing he wants. He wants to write plays. He wants to write poetry. He ends up in a band. 20s. World famous. I listened to an interview that he did with some people the other day. Listen to the interview the other day. It was recorded in the 60s, perfectly clear. And the interviewers are asking him, they're pontificating, endlessly pontificating about how How nice it would be, wouldn't it, Jim? How nice would it be if you didn't have to deal with publicists, you didn't have to deal with the record company, you didn't have to deal with copywriters, you didn't have to deal with your accountants, all those people trying to bleed you. Wouldn't that be good? And he would never agree to that. He said, yeah, it's a pain. Yes, it's awful. And he said, but there's something about the struggle. He said, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. He said, let's say there's a rich baroness. Let's say. A rich baroness who decides she wants to finance a band. She wants to start a band. And she pays for everything. She puts them in a palatial mansion high up in the Tibetan mountains where nobody's going to bother them. They don't got to deal with any of these people. All they got to do is write their music. That's it. Be left alone. And he asked the interviewers, what do you think would happen? And Morrison answers his own rhetorical question. He says, well, they're probably going to write a lot of crap is what probably. They'll write a lot of crap. A bunch of weird, esoteric stuff that nobody's going to ever care about. That's what they're going to do. I agree with him. Of course that's what there's something about the struggle. It makes you smarter. It makes you stronger. It makes you see more things. There's something about that. I agree with him. Of course, this is only an impartial, imperfect explanation of delayed or unanswered prayers, but truly only God knows the answers. It's what makes God God and us us. Now we see through a glass darkly, wrote St. Paul, and truly we do. We see through that glass darkly. God's ways are not our ways. Prayer does work. However, all mature saints know that God does not heed our time schedule or use methods that we would use, and sometimes the most reasonable prayer is answered with a firm but loving no. And it brings us to the final thing to be said. In the meantime, while we're waiting for God's answer to our prayer, we need to do all we can to provide our own answer to our prayers. If there's something constructive you can do while you're waiting, by all means do it. Of course. There's an old Italian proverb that says, call on God, but row away from the rocks. You have to admire, don't you? You got to admire the widows in Jesus' parable. You got to admire her. She didn't wait for somebody else to solve her problems for her. She took responsibility for her situation. She did all she could, and that's a good lesson for all of us. Don't give up on your prayers ever. God does hear. He does answer the prayers of his people. Sometimes the answer is be patient. Sometimes it's no. But always the answer will be for our best good. In the meantime, while we're waiting, let's remember. Let's remember that persistent widow, that take whatever constructive action we can to be part of the solution. If we do, we have Christ's promise that God will reward our persistence. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen.